Hey guys, how's it going? I thought today I'd tackle the story of Snark the Kakapo. Snark is almost a lost figure in the Kakapo story. And I think it's a real shame because when you hear and understand the Kakapo story, it really can't be told without Snark the Kakapo. If you jump on over to the Kakapo Wikipedia page, he doesn't really feature at all. And when I first discovered Kakapo, I read about him and then he just disappeared from the story. And I thought I'd like to tell you his complete story because I think it's really important how we understand Kakapo today. And we wouldn't. The program at best would have been set back years had it not been for him. So, what's helpful to understand is it is traditionally believed that the last Kakapo breeding that was seen in New Zealand was probably in the early 1900s, 1901, 1902, 1903, maybe 1905. And it is believed that the last Kakapo that bred on mainland New Zealand bred in Fiordland in the 1930s. Now, this is incorrect. There is recent newspaper articles of people finding Kakapo nests on the west coast in the late 1940s, which almost certainly would suggest that there were Kakapo breeding later than that. However, for whatever reason, this has become fixed in the Kakapo story that the last breeding happened in the 1930s, and it really seems impossible to dislodge this set of facts from the story. This set of stories from the narrative. For better or for worse, it is widely and was widely believed that no Kakapo had bred in New Zealand since at the latest the 1930s. Now, this presented a huge problem for people who were searching for Kakapo on mainland New Zealand on Stewart Island because all they could find were male Kakapo. Probably a bunch of good reasons for that in the sense that they're looking for Kakapo sign. They find the best evidence of Kakapo sign in an area is a male's track and bowl system. And the best way to find a physical Kakapo is to find a male Kakapo bird. Female Kakapo, outside of maybe the occasional feather that they drop, and maybe the occasional piece of feeding sign, leave next to no sign. So even if there were female Kakapo living in Fiordland, it's unlikely we would have found them. But whatever the case, there was a real belief that there were no female Kakapo left, and that we were looking at a dying species. In fact, we were looking at an already extinct species, and these were the last individuals. We couldn't save it. And 1978, there were roughly 18 male Kakapo left known to exist in Fiordland. Goodbye. These will die out in a few years. It's been nice. And then but there's nothing we can do. And then in the early 80s, actually no, it's not true. In 1979, 1980, Kakapo were rediscovered on Stewart Island, and a population of 100 to 200 was discovered there. And the first female was captured in the early 1980s. Several more were captured over the following months. And what is fascinating is a female named Alice was captured, and she nested in the 1980-1981 breeding season. And she produced a nest, and in that nest hatched a Kakapo chick. And I believe a bottle of whiskey was given to the guy who discovered that nest. There's a fun fact for you. If you discover a Kakapo nest, you deserve a bottle of whiskey, or at least that is a standard laid down by our conservation forefathers. I'm sure that there's a few rangers in southern Fiordland and off the coast of Stewart Island today who would question where their bottle of whiskey is. Question for the Department of Conservation, not myself. But nonetheless, the first person who discovered a Kakapo nest, was given a bottle of whiskey, and for good reason, because it was proof that the species could be saved. It's proof that these females were breeding, and with breeding came hope. And it's a huge moment for the recovery program, because up until that point in time, there had been precious little hope for Kakapo. And this young male Kakapo, who went from a little ball of floof to a green wobbly toddler, and then fledged into a little mini Kakapo, represented the future. And then he fledged, and there was a handover of teams around that time on the island, and he disappeared. And remember, in fact, there were several other chicks on that island, and they all disappeared around the same time. And because there were cats hunting and killing adult Kakapo, it was assumed that they had been killed. And then, 12 months later, a team moved in to translocate or shift some Kakapo to offshore islands where they could safely breed. And they discovered a young male Kakapo with a leg band 6 kilometers away. And they realized it was this toddler whose name was Snark. And it was named Snark after the Snark transmitters that were attached to Kakapo to help locate them. The idea that the lost Kakapo had been found, I believe. And maybe a hint of irony there as well, that, hopefully if he had a transmitter on him this time, the Snark would work and Snark would not go missing. Well, whatever the case, he was shifted to an offshore island. And what was exciting as well is he wasn't the only bird. Another young Kakapo was discovered around that time who appeared to be the same age. And so Snark and his little mate Heather and about 16 or 17 other birds were shifted to Little Barrier Island. And Snark proved invaluable. He'd firstly proved invaluable during the breeding season because he could be studied and we could verify what was true around Kakapo young being raised. But now he became extremely important because by studying his development, researchers were able to pinpoint when Kakapo reached critical levels of maturity. When a bird first began to develop the ability to boom and to attract females, to at what age they constructed track and bowl systems, and what age they began to become dominant. And Snark had constructed track and bowl systems within a few years of being on the Little Barrier Island. And by 1985, 1986, he was booming heavily. He began to put on condition and weight and sort of bulk up. And he, in 88, 89, he played a major part in the breeding season, really began to exert his dominance. I think it was around this time, or possibly the following breeding season, that he began to compete directly with other males for the best spots on the island. Now, Kakapo males tend to compete for the highest spot or a couple of prominent spots in an area usually located around a specific focal point. And this focal point is usually the highest point, although not always. But there are definitely key points in a geographic area that male Kakapo want to be, because they present the best opportunity to present themselves to female Kakapo. Snark began fighting with other birds. He began to fight with Arab, I believe Luke and Bernard. And what was fascinating is around that time, other male Kakapo were competing too. And so it gave researchers a real benchmark to see, okay, well, here's what the top boys are doing. Here's the young upstart, and what's the difference between him and these other birds? And to be honest, pretty quickly it became evident that there wasn't much. There were only a few female Kakapo and only a few bred. So it's hard to say with certainty the degree to which he became effective in what he was doing. But Snark provided over 10 years an unparalleled window into the life of a young Kakapo. And the evidence and research we gained from him was crucial, because until 1991, no other known Kakapo chick would survive to maturity. And it wasn't until 1996 that 1997, that any real numbers of Kakapo chicks began to survive to maturity. And if we hadn't been able to observe Snark, the program could have been set back 5 or 10 years. And that would have potentially represented the extinction of the species, given how few Kakapo were left. Maybe not entirely, but the program certainly would have been an extreme disadvantage were it not for young Snark. Now, unfortunately, Snark's story has a sad ending. It's not known exactly when, but it seems almost certain that Snark died, possibly in a fight on Little Barrier Island. It's not unexpected. In the last few years, we've seen several other male Kakapo who are young and around the same age as Snark get into extremely serious fights that have led to their injury or death. It seems to be a key component of the young male Kakapo's life when he decides to become an upstart and not just compete, but try and take over the top track and bowl systems in an area. As I've gone over the notes from the Kakapo recovery team who were present at Little Barrier Island in 1994, it seems very likely that sometime during that season, sometime between April and May, maybe June, Snark died in a fight. There was activity on his track and bowl system during that period of time, and evidence of several fights between him, I believe the male Kakapo Arab, and the male Kakapo Luke. And then after that season, he is never seen again. And activity on his track and bowl system really seemed to have ended before most of the other birds, suggesting that he probably got hurt in a fight and went away and died somewhere quietly and was not seen again. It's a sad story because when I was a kid, I remember reading this amazing and incredible story of the first Kakapo chick that was ever found. And Snark just disappeared. It was because Snark himself had disappeared. And I don't think anyone really knew how to tell his story because he represented such incredible hope, and then he was just gone. And I think in many ways it was not only a bitter pill that this incredible young bird who carried with him the hopes of a species was just gone at such a crucial time, but also there just wasn't really anyone who was able to tell his story. Because at that stage, there wasn't much hope in it. There probably doesn't seem like there's much value in telling a depressing story about a Kakapo who carries the hopes of his species and then just dies. Nowadays, we can probably look at the story in a new light. After all, 90% of the Kakapo population today are young birds. There's been this incredible turnaround, As of last week, there were 256 Kakapo in the world. It's a wonderful and incredible number. And many of those birds wouldn't exist if it wasn't for our understanding of Kakapo that came from Snark and from studying him and being able to apply the techniques that we learned from him into raising and helping other Kakapo. So, there's real benefit in Snark's story. And even the loss of Snark helps us to be able to look at things today and recognize, well, Kakapo male mortality is a critical part of breeding seasons. And maybe if it wasn't for Snark, we wouldn't have been able to save the male Tikingi, who got in a huge fight a few months ago. And it was only through his transmitter function having been set to pick up when his body activity decreased that his life was able to be saved. And so in many ways, this young male Kakapo who evaded detection because he didn't have a transmitter, was named after a transmitter and helped us understand the transmitters that we have, saved another male Kakapo, or at least played a part in the story of his saving, because it allowed us to take a step towards reconsidering the function and use of a transmitter. So, I hope you found that interesting. Stay tuned for another story.